kind of horizon analysis of every act of the will, even the simplest, like getting out of bed, you finally come to the summum bonum.
Okay, so let me walk through that. Because I think that's a useful thing to think about. Technically, I've thought about identity in this regard, because identity is a nested structure.
Yeah.
It's also a lens through which we view the world. And so if I'm sitting at my typewriter typing, you might ask me what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is, well, I'm moving my fingers up and down.
Yeah.
But then that's true. And the next answer is, well, I'm producing words on a page, but I'm also producing phrases,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm producing sentences, and I'm producing paragraphs, and then chapters, and then a book. And then you might say, well, are you writing a book, or are you being a professor? And I'd say, no, well, I'm being a professor, pushing my fingers up and down on this keypad. And then you might say, well, what's professor nested in? And the
Mm-hmm.
answer to that would be something like, well, good citizen. And then that's nested in good man. And then that's nested in, well, then that's right where you start to encounter what I think are something like religious presuppositions. It's like,
Right.
well, what exactly do you mean by good man? And I think,
Exactly.
I think psychologically, well, that means to act out the mythological hero. It seems to me to take faith to operate always when we don't know what we're doing, and we usually don't know what we're doing. And so part of the reason that you have to have faith is because you're actually ignorant, and it fills in the gaps, right? Because otherwise you'd be stuck with a never-ending regress. You just ask why all the time, and then you could never act, because the why has to end somewhere. And I think virtually by definition, it ends with an act of faith. That might be akin to your idea about faith being beyond reason. It's like, well, look, if I ask you why you're having this conversation with me, you'll give me a reason. And if I ask you why that reason is valid, you'll give me another reason. And if I do that 5 or 6 times, you're going to run out of reasons. But you're still having the conversation. God. So that means you have faith that the conversation can go somewhere good. And that's not actually a delusion.
No. And actually you're moving toward God. And I think that's a classic route in our tradition. And just the way you were doing it. Why are we having this conversation? I can give, these particular reasons, but then ask the why again, ask it a third, a fourth, a fifth time. Finally, I'm going to get to something like, well, because I want to be happy. What ultimately motivates the will is some desire for happiness. Well, no, what's happiness? Well, keep pressing that question. It can't be something simply in this world. We all know that doesn't make us happy in the way that we're seeking. It's something like the summum bonum, right? Something like the ultimate good. I want to be happy in the fullest possible sense all the time, which is why, Teilhard de Chardin said this, that I wouldn't get out of bed in the morning unless I believe in God. And that's what he meant, was if you do that kind of horizon analysis of every act of the will, even the simplest, like getting out of bed, you finally come to the summum bonum.
Okay, so let me walk through that. Because I think that's a useful thing to think about. Technically, I've thought about identity in this regard, because identity is a nested structure.
Yeah.
It's also a lens through which we view the world. And so if I'm sitting at my typewriter typing, you might ask me what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. And the answer is, well, I'm moving my fingers up and down.
Yeah.
But then that's true. And the next answer is, well, I'm producing words on a page, but I'm also producing phrases, mm-hmm. and I'm producing sentences, and I'm producing paragraphs, and then chapters, and then a book. And then you might say, well, are you writing a book, or are you being a professor? And I'd say, no, well, I'm being a professor, pushing my fingers up and down on this keypad. And then you might say, well, what's professor nested in? And the mm-hmm. answer to that would be something like, well, good citizen. And then that's nested in good man. And then that's nested in, well, then that's right where you start to encounter what I think are something like religious presuppositions. It's like, well, what exactly do you mean by good man? And I think psychologically, well, that means to act out the mythological hero. And that's exactly the point where that identity touches on something that's, I think, indistinguishable from religion at that end. Now, I'm not sure what that means about God per se.
I would say this, that God in our great tradition could be defined as the good in its unconditioned form. So all the things you've been raising here, so the why, I'm answering with some kind of good, with a conditioned good. The very fact that I can put it in a wider context means it's conditioned. It's good, I'm seeking it, but it's not the ultimate thing I'm seeking. So unless we have an infinite regress, which I think is repugnant to reason.
And immobilizing. There are people who have neurological conditions that put them into an infinite regress, and they cannot act.
Right. So if that's repugnant both, let's say, epistemically and psychologically, we have to come to something that's properly called the unconditioned good, good in its absolute form, that which is desirable simply for its own sake. So Aquinas will say God is called good because God is the supremely desirable. What do we desire? Thomas says some form of actuality or being. That's why we call God the fully real, that which is most actual, actus purus, right? But I like the analysis that comes not so much cosmologically, but psychologically from what motivates me. And finally, unless my life just sort of founders into irrationality, I am motivated ultimately by God.
Right. Well, I think so, because, I would also say, well, let's reject that argument and say, well, you're not nested in good man, good citizen, hero, and then beyond that, cosmic hero. And I think psychologically speaking, the figure of Christ is, if nothing else, a cosmic hero. And I'm not saying it's nothing else, but it's at least that. Well, what would the alternative be? Well, you wouldn't be doing what was good. Well, then what's on the outskirts of your value structure is something that's adversarial, something that's the opposite of good. And maybe you're likely, in fact, your psyche is not pure, and you vary depending on your faith, I suppose. But there's no escaping being nested in some sort of transcendent structure like that. And then I think of it this way. So you have these outermost reach of your identity structure, which is something like whatever the idea of good man is grounded in. And I do think it's grounded in this hero narrative. But then I look at the hero narrative and I think, well, that's a biologically, that's an emergent narrative. It has evolutionary roots. It's something like man has discovered that his goal is to move into the unknown, to confront what's predatory and dangerous, and to garner something of great value in return, and to share it with the community. And it's an ancient story. Mm-hmm. It echoes through the Old Testament continually. It's even there. It's even there. It lurks underneath the accounts of God's creation itself. And that means that outermost rim of identity is something that has an evolutionary origin. And then you think, well, that means that it has to be connected. It's connected with reality in some fundamental sense. Does that demonstrate the existence of God? That's a different question. But you can make a logical case for the necessity of that hypothesis of goodness to that point, as far as I can tell.
Well, stay first with your example of someone, let's say, who's really wicked. And there are wicked people. We can analyze that psychologically or
two of them are sitting right here.
Well, yeah. I mean, because it goes right through the human heart, as Solzhenitsyn said. But Thomas Aquinas says a wicked person, even the most wicked person, is seeking at least the apparent good. So something that appears good to that person. Now, they could be totally mixed up about it. It's not, in fact, good for them, but at least it appears good to them. So even the most wicked person, Thomas says, is inchoately seeking God, because it's always some good. And now he's got the wrong sense of it, but he's still being drawn and motivated by this first cause of the will, even the most wicked person. See, but I think that's a sign of hope. That means grace is always possible. Now read, whether it's Dostoevsky or Flannery O'Connor and people that talk about the most wicked types, but they're sometimes the place where grace breaks through, because they are seeking God in their perverse way. So in a way, he's got us coming or going. Whether we're Mother Teresa or we're a wicked Dostoevsky character, we're all seeking God in some way. And I agree with you about the Bible. The Bible.
Well, I'm not that optimistic, because I don't think that all evil actions are misguided. I think that because And I think that's best illustrated in the story of Cain and Abel. And I took the story of Cain extremely seriously. I think it has unbelievable explanatory power. It's quite staggering, that the power of that story, the explanatory power, especially for how short it is. Cain is resentful. He has his reasons. His sacrifices were repudiated by God for reasons that aren't made clear in the text, which is a great ambiguity, because often our sacrifices are repudiated. And Cain is bitter, and no wonder. And he has Abel around to rub his nose in it as well. But Cain's reaction is, I'm going to destroy what God values most. And that, now you might say, well, Cain is conflicted and ambivalent about that. And I believe that, but I don't think he was seeking the good when he struck down. He was shaking his fist at God.
Yeah, indeed he was, objectively, but he was seeking at least the apparent good for him. In his twisted mind, he thought that was the good.
I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I think you can get to a point where you're so resentful. I really believe this, that you're so resentful that you will do harm to yourself as well as everyone else, and actively.
True, but a suicide is seeking at least the apparent good. A suicidal person thinks my non-existence is a good thing. So they are seeking the good, but in a twisted, misguided way. And to me, it's got metaphysical roots, because I would hold to the classical view that evil is a privatio boni, right? It's a privation of the good. So good is always more fundamental than evil. It has to be. They're not co-equal principles fighting away. So I'd repudiate any sort of Gnostic or Manichaean system.
I believe that too. I believe that. I thought about that a lot. Jung is being accused of Manichaeism, for example, because he took evil so seriously.
Who has? Sorry, I couldn't hear.
Carl
Jung
was accused of Manichaeism. But he took evil extraordinarily seriously, which is something that's definitely worth doing. So you look at examples like the Columbine killers. The suicide could have come before the murders, but it didn't. Mm-hmm. And so I even see maybe in those situations the desire for non-existence, not so much as a seeking of the good, but a desire to punish God for the inadequacy of his creation.
Yeah, oh no, it could be. But at least in their mind, that's a good thing. So that's the Cain connection, that the resentment against God and getting back at God. Sure, I see it in the pastoral life all the time.
It's a justified thing. They think
for them it is,
God deserves it because look at what's happened.
But see, but God has his coming or going, because that is in fact a quest for God. That's right. I mean, even the most resistant sinner is in fact under grace in that sense. That's why I've always liked both Origen and C.S. Lewis say this, that it's the love of God that lights up the fires of hell, right? If someone's in hell, it's the resistance to God's love that's lighting up the fires, that's causing the friction. And so God has you coming or going. I mean, is God present in hell? Sure, because whatever is has to be grounded in God. And God's even present in the fires of hell because it's the resistance against God that's causing them, So I think it's a metaphysical statement and a psychological statement about the primacy of the good. But it's a source of hope. And a lot of my pastoral work, and you as a psychologist too, when you go into people's pain in a very deep way, and priests go all the time to these limit situations where people have lost loved ones, they're facing their own death, they're facing tremendous failure. That's where priests go, because that's often where grace is going to break through.
Well, I've encountered situations as a clinician, where religious language is the only language that can be used to describe what's happening. That's quite interesting. It's difficult to relay those experiences outside the specific framework of the occurrences. Yeah.
I always think of, Hegel said, to know a limit as a limit is to be beyond the limit. And I think that's true here. So whether it's the physical sciences or psychology, our reason comes to a certain limit, but then it recognizes the limit as a limit. And that's to be already beyond it in a way. And they often talk about religious questions as limit questions, or it's a limit situation. When I begin to ask the meta question beyond questions, or I come to a meta experience beyond any ordinary experience. And that's why, again, priests tend to show up at those limit cases. That's when we're looking into this abyss. And it is, from our standpoint, rather abyssal. I mean, what is it that stands beyond what I can know and control? And there's this, I mean, do a Kierkegaardian, there's a kind of leap that abyss is something loving. And what stands beyond what I can control is a force of love that's actually summoning me. And that's where you go back to what I said about Deus Dixit, God speaking through the scriptures. I think that's what it means. The voice from the cloud is a symbol of it, you know. When someone hears the voice of God, it's coming from the abyss. It always is. Job, you know, the voice comes out of the whirlwind. So your eyes are closed and you know, you can't see anything, but from the whirlwind comes the voice. Because, and again, that speech is so important because, Job, where were you when I did all these? I mean, what do you know about what's going on? You know nothing about what's going on. But from the abyss beyond reason comes the voice. And the Bible witnesses to that stuff all the time. And boy, it happens in people's experience. I mean, you and I both know that. When you come up against limits, what comes out of the abyss is a very interesting thing.
Well, one of the ways that